because once you have perfection, what's the only thing you're missing? Imperfection. And it's kind of like in the idea that if gods are perfect, they created humans so that they could have imperfections. They could have their opposite halves, their shadow side, be what they're missing. That's their fulfilling moment. The pictures of Dorian Gray. Now this is going to be a spoiler filled, summary. It's going to actually go through what happens in the story. So I actually made another video about where there's no spoilers, but it's just a review of the book. It gives the general topics of the story, and it doesn't go into any detail. If you haven't read it yet, check out that video. If you read it already, or if you got to study this for class or whatever, this is going to go through what happens. So it starts off with these different entities, right? These three beings that are the main people in the story. Well, there's a fourth, but the first one is Basil Howard. He is a painter, right? That's his job. He paints for a living, and that's what he does. He's involved in art in every single way that you can imagine. And then you have his opposite, Henry, Lord Henry, or they call him Harry, and he represents the intelligent side of the world, right? He's always talking about you got to use your brain to move forward in life. But he also plays the devil's advocate. Anytime somebody says yes to something, he says no. When someone says it's hot outside, he says it's cold. He loves to pick people's brains apart by being this opposite person. He loves to contradict people to see how strong the brain really is and truly believe what's going on. And then you have the person that's stuck in the middle. You have Dorian Gray. He's this young, attractive man he gets painted, right? Basil, the art guy, invites him over and he just paints him all the time. And Basil, when he first met him, he was telling Lord Henry, he said, I saw this man at a party and I thought he was just absolutely beautiful. He's like, but I didn't want to get to know him. I didn't want to get to know him because I wanted the imagination of him to remain perfect. What I thought of him could stay pure in my mind, because if I get to know him and I find out he's less than perfect or less than what I hyped him up to be, then I won't be able to paint him the same. So he says, I just want to know limited information about this handsome man and just paint him. And so he painted him through his own lens, and he was, going through his whole process of inviting him over all the time and perfecting his art by painting him. And then so as Dorian is going to Basil's house, Henry keeps talking to Basil and talking to him about why should anyone care about beauty if beauty is skin deep and it goes away. You only have a limited amount of years to be beautiful, and then you become old and gray. And if you're old and gray and dumb, then you're not living life fully. You should at least be focused on intelligence. He's like, the most intelligent people are ugly and the most beautiful people aren't intelligent. He's like, there's rare cases where that doesn't happen, but for the most part it's true. He's like, and I'd rather be old, ugly, and intelligent. And here's this young Dorian Gray who's a model, and he's like listening to this guy talk about how beauty leaves your body, and he's like, whoa, like what is this? I never thought about this in my life. He's like, I'm young and these older men are talking about what life's experiences are. He's like, and I don't know anything about it, and it's just molding his brain in different directions. And even Basil notices that he has his open mouth when he's painting him, because he's just awestruck by all this information. And he ends up just loving Henry. He ends up just loving his brain, and he wants to know more, and he invites himself over to Henry's house. He constantly goes and looks for him. And there's points where you see where Henry gets his information from. He hangs out with high people in society. He has his uncle who gives him all this information. He goes to his uncle to ask for the history of Dorian Gray. And Henry is just, he's just living his life. He doesn't care about anything. He doesn't care about other people's feelings. He loves to tell people no. He loves to get on people's bad side, but he thinks it's fun. He likes living that life where it's on the edge, and he doesn't want to sit back and be calm. And so one of these times when Lord Henry is talking to Basil and Dorian while they're all in the same room while Dorian's getting painted, Henry starts talking about beauty, and Dorian says to himself, I wish I could be beautiful forever. I wish I could stay young forever and handsome. And later on, you see Dorian get into a relationship. He meets this actress. Her name is Sybil Vane. And he meets her, and they start, hitting it off. And she doesn't even call him by his real name. She calls him Prince Charming, kind of like how Basil called, Dorian just this. Or he didn't call him anything, but the way he just wanted to imagine him how he was. He never really dealt with reality. He wanted just everything that was on the surface area, like beauty. And so Sybil is just head over heels for Dorian, and they plan to get married. And Dorian tells Henry, and Henry's like, this is fantastic. I want to see her act. She's an actress. Let's go see her. And Dorian's like, she could play every role. She could play Cleopatra. She could play Juliet from Romeo and Juliet. She could play all these amazing women. And it's so fascinating that she's beautiful and has a deep understanding of the world and lives, and it's like she lived different lives before, so it's like she's this person who has everything. And so they go to see her, they go to watch her play, and She was absolutely terrible. Henry was like, what am I watching? Basil was like, this is like an awkward butchering of Shakespeare. And they were all just, they hated it. And so after the party's over, Dorian goes to talk to her at backstage, and he tells her, he's like, what happened? You know, like, why were you so bad? And she's like, I did it for you. She's like, I don't need acting anymore. She's like, I used acting as a way to fill that void in my heart, because I thought this is what I love. She's like, but now that I love you, I could put you in that void, and acting can go out the door. She's like, because I don't want to be an actress anymore. I want to be your wife, and I want to be with you. She's like, don't you get it? I'm doing this for us. And he hated it. He's like, you're not who I thought you were. He's like, you were supposed to be this woman who understands everything about life, but here you are, some dumb, young, you know, head over heels actress who can't even act anymore. And he called off the wedding. And he was just so cold. And it's the first time you see some real emotion come out of Dorian besides being awestruck. And he's so cold to her, and he tells her, like, I don't want to marry you anymore. And she's clinging to his knees, telling him, don't go. And he's like, I don't care. He's like, I'm not, we're through. And so he stays up late at night. And it's funny because once that happened, it goes back to talking about how beautiful life was. You know, he noticed all the streetcars, all the street lamps, and all these different colors going on in life. And it's very important. That only happens a few times in the book. It happens in the very beginning with Henry and Basil, and it happens after this and after a few other moments. But it's a key point. So he goes back home, and the next day Henry goes to his house, and he's like, did you open my letter? And Dorian's like, what letter? He's like, you know, Sybil's dead. She died last night. And then Dorian was just confused. He's like, what? And he just awestruck, and Henry tells him the story about how she went back inside to the theater and she drank this concoction that killed her. And so he starts thinking like, wow. He's like, I killed her. And he didn't cry. He didn't really care. He was just like, wow. And Henry was confused. He's like, you know, this is your fiance. Shouldn't you feel something? And then he was like, no, she's gone. You know, what am I gonna do? Why cry over spilled milk? So it was weird. You know, Henry was like, this guy's a little off. And so Henry leaves. Dorian goes back, and he just has a normal day. He acts like nothing happened. And he goes to look at the picture that Basil gave him, and he sees that the picture is changed. He sees that the picture has an ugly smile now. He's like, and it was a perfect picture. And he's like, what's going on? He starts realizing that his consciousness, he sold his beauty. That's why he didn't feel anything. He sold his consciousness for eternal beauty. And so now his consciousness is painted on this portrait of him. Now every time he does something evil, the portrait is going to reflect it, and he's going to remain young forever. And it was just very interesting to see. And he gets freaked out at first, and then he comes into terms with it. And he goes off on this trip, and he starts, discovering what beauty is. He goes deep into, Greek poetry, into pottery, into music, into all these different things. And he just develops his whole life around beauty. And before Sybil died, her brother told her, like, if anyone ever hurts you, he's like, I swear I'll harm them. He's like, I'm going to go away on a fishing trip or to be a sailor. He's like, but I care about you so much. And he had a whole thing with the mom, and he didn't want her to marry him. He's like, you don't even know his name. And she's like, it's Prince Charming. And he's like, you don't know who he is? She's like, of course I do. He's Prince Charming. And then her brother hated that. So he tells her, he's like, I just want you to be safe. And this is a time where back then we're saying I'll kill someone was considered like, oh my God, what are you saying? And so fast forward back to the present time. So Dorian Gray comes back home from his, venturing. He was out overseas and discovering all these beautiful artifacts, and he comes back home, and he looks at his picture, and it's just hideous. It's disgusting. The portrait is just god awful. He bumps into Basil after a long time. They're walking on the street late at night, and Basil recognizes Dorian, and he's like, whoa, this kid hasn't aged. And he's like, hey, Dorian, it's me. He's like, how have you been? He's like, and they start catching up, and Dorian didn't want to see him that much. And he's like, dang. He's like, I don't want to talk to this guy right now. But they bump into each other, and Basil asks him, conversation comes up. Basil asks him, how is the painting? And he's like, I want to see it. He's like, I gotta, I'm moving to Paris because I'm gonna be a full-time painter. He's like, and I want to see my greatest work. And Dorian doesn't want to see it because by this point, it's just hideous. It's disgusting. And he tells him, he's like, no. And eventually he does. He lets him inside. He says, okay. And while he's in there, he didn't want to open the thing for him because this place was kind of like his subconscious. This was his childhood memories were in this room. He locked it away. He put a cover on it, and he only opened it in very few occasions when he wanted to see if it changed. And this reflected, that those deep parts of the brain that you hide and lock away, that you don't try to see anymore. The parts of your soul that reflect on your face that you try not to. That stress that that you have bags under your eyes, your eyebrows get furrowed, you get wrinkles because you're so stressed. All that stuff they try to hide. He literally hid it in a room. And he doesn't want to open it for him, and finally he does, and he shows Basil the painting, and Basil he's like, this isn't the same painting. He's staring at it. He's like, you changed it, you altered it, and he's looking at the painting. He's like, it's original. And then Dorian starts getting the idea. He's like, he can't leave this room. This man can't know what happened. This man can't know that I am not normal. He can't know that I'm not human in a way, because he sold his soul for beauty. So Dorian, remembering the other day that he was in that room, that he left the knife on the counter, he walks up to it while thinking. He's like, he can't know my secret. And he grabs a knife and he slowly walks toward Basil. And at this point, Basil was sitting on a table with his hands or you're just sitting on a table, and he was just all stressed, wondering how this could have happened. And Dorian pulls up behind him, knife in hand, lifts it up and plunges it into his neck, and he stabs him repeatedly, and he lays him flat on the table with Basil's arms spread forward, laying face down, and he stabs him a couple of times, and he's officially dead. And he sees the blood leaking out of him, and he stopped moving, and he just stares at him. And Dorian is just thinking, it's like, he's not really thinking anything. He just stares at him in a blank state. And I don't know if it was in order to feel something again, or to just have his brain register what happened. He picks up the knife and starts stabbing him again a few more times, and again he felt nothing. So then afterwards, he starts looking out the window. He starts looking at all the streetlights, and he sees again the beautiful colors, the beautiful, the neon signs and all these colorful buildings. And it's interesting because when you see documentaries of serial killers, they feel at peace after they kill. Once they actually murdered something or someone, they actually feel calm and relaxed, and they can enjoy the environment, and they're not just stuck in their head all the time. And this is exactly what happened to Dorian. And so he calls a chemist, his old friend that he knew, who they're not friends anymore. He forces him to do it. He gives him a note that says, I'll review your secret, but they never says what the secret was. And the chemist says, I hate you, Dorian Gray. Don't ever call me over here again. He's like, I gotta go get all my acid and stuff. And he disintegrates the body. He gets rid of Basil. He gets rid of the evidence. It's like he was never there, And so the scientist leaves, and he runs into Henry again. Dorian runs into Henry, and Henry's like, oh, this lady likes you. You should hang out with her more. And Dorian's like, I don't want to. He just wants to stay indoors. He just wants to pretend like nothing happened. He just wants to read a book. He just wants to hang out. Dorian starts getting into he wants to feel again. He hasn't felt in years, Now that he had beauty, nothing made him feel, because once you have perfection, what's the only thing you're missing? Imperfection. And he was just searching for more and more and more perfect things, and he couldn't find them. So he comes back home, and he remembers that there was an opium bar, and he pays a taxi. He goes to an opium bar, and it's kind of like in the idea that if gods are perfect, they created humans so that they could have imperfections. They could have their opposite halves, their shadow side, be what they're missing. That's their fulfilling moment. So that's what he tries to do. He feels nothing, so he wants to feel something. Even if it's something terrible, he goes to drugs. He goes to an opium bar, and he gives money to these girls who just hassle him for money. He smokes a little bit, and he's like, what am I doing here? And he leaves, and as he leaves, one of the girls that hassled him for money says, bye, Prince Charming. At this point, the only person that knew him as Prince Charming was a sailor, and lo and behold, there was a man sitting in the bar, chases after him with a gun. He's like, you hurt my sister Sybil. You caused her to kill herself. And he's like, it's not me. He's like, I would be like 20 years older, don't you think? He's like, look at me. He's like, I'm a young man. That couldn't possibly be me. And he convinces the guy to let him go. The lady that was hassling him for money, she tells him, she's like, you fool. She's like, don't you understand? He made a deal with the devil, and he's young forever now for some reason. And so he starts getting confused, and he starts looking for him. And Dorian Gray at home, out the window, he sees, when he's at a party, he sees the sailor out the window with the gun. He's terrified, and he's petrified, and he tries to stay indoors and hides himself away from him all the time. But eventually he has to come back out again. So he goes out, and it's funny because it's like the consequences of his subconscious are coming back to haunt him. A real life version of what that was. So he goes shooting with Henry and one of their friends, and right before the friend is about to shoot at the bushes, Henry's like, no, don't shoot. and they shoot because they thought it was a rabbit, and an arm falls out with a revolver in it, and it was actually the sailor waiting for him in the bushes gonna shoot him. And Dorian was like, how come I wanted to stop him from shooting an innocent rabbit when that's what we came here to do, for hunting? And it was almost like his subconscious knew, like, you shouldn't kill the evil parts of your, you shouldn't kill what's the evil side of your brain. And him hiding in the bushes is kind of like a symbolism for the road he was heading down. He was gonna get murdered by the evil things that he did in life, and it was like all catching up to him. And then so Dorian just he was in a super stressed state of mind, and he finally felt, real emotion again. He felt stressed, after so long of not feeling anything. And he goes home and he grabs a knife, he looks at the painting and he hates it, and he's so mad at it. And what he does is he picks it up and he plunges it into the art, and people hear a scream, and so they run inside and bust down Dorian's door, and they find an old, weathered, stressed out man on the floor with a kitchen knife and a beautiful painting that was slashed open, hanging in the room. And it was so weird how it all reverted back to normal, and I never really understood why it ended like that. Maybe it was all in his head. Maybe people just kept telling him he was beautiful, but he wasn't. Maybe he really had a psychotic break. Maybe he thought in time he stopped, or I don't know, who knows. Maybe Lord Henry is supposed to be the devil, because he plays the devil's advocate in every situation. He loves telling people no, hot when it's cold, cold when it's hot, and he just likes getting on people's nerves. And when I was reading the book, I was like, wow, this guy really plays the devil's advocate. And then when he was being painted, Dorian is always pulled between these two different forces. You have Henry, who loves being evil and malicious, and he just live life, be temptatious, and fall to victim to all these things, because you're gonna die one day and you have to enjoy it while it lasts. And here comes Basil, who was practically in love with this young man. He starts idolizing him, and he pushes down his emotions because of what society would think, and he's a civilized version and Henry is the uncivilized version. And so it's funny though, because Basil is actually, he doesn't know how to talk to people. He hates being in parties, he hates being social. So he lives life, he has the appearance of a civilized person by just being calm and humble and pushing everything down, whereas Henry comes off as this intellectual man, but he loves the wild side of life. And it's funny how there's just such oxymorons in between them two, and between them two and themselves. And so Dorian was caught between these two forces, and he ended up going with, more so, Henry, and just living life the way he wanted to live it. And then at the end of the day, Henry was like a symbolism for the evil side of things. And maybe it was all in Dorian Gray's head, but we never really know. But that's the summary of the book. It was a fun read. I had no idea what I was getting myself into. I didn't know anything about the book. I didn't know anything. I just knew that it was a classic story, and it kept popping up in all these different versions, like all leather bound. And I was like, I gotta read this story, and I'm glad I did. I think it's a very fun psych-related book, and it touches on a lot of details of, like, if you feel nothing, or if you had a traumatic experience, a lot of people start resorting to drugs. If you're a serial killer, if you feel no empathy for people, the only time you actually feel calm is after you've killed. And these are real things that I've seen in documentaries, and it's pretty interesting how Oscar Wilde got it all correct, as if he's studied this for a long time. I don't know anything about him, so if anybody knows, let me know. But that's the summary of the Pictures of Dorian Gray. I hope you guys enjoy. I tried to do it as not time consuming as possible, but it's a good story, and there's a lot of details into it, a lot of little things that make sense afterwards, after you finish reading it. But that's the story. If you're really interested, I highly recommend checking it out. And take care, everybody.